Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week. What are you bringing to the table today?
I am bringing an article that was published online at Prism called Trump's Targeting of Student Protesters Open New Lines of Attack. It was written by Neha Madhira, and this article is about Mahmoud Khalil, a green card holder, permanent resident who graduated from Columbia recently. He was part of the group that organized the encampment at Columbia in opposition to the genocide in Gaza. And as I noted when I introduced this last week, Trump promised that this arrest would be the first of many to come.
Yeah.
And that's coming true.
Yes, unfortunately so.
Yeah. And Alireza Durudi, an Iranian mechanical engineering doctoral student at the University of Alabama, was detained by ICE on March 26th. And Rumeysa Ozturk, a Turkish national and PhD student at Tufts University, was snatched off the street by unidentified ICE agents. And, tangentially related to this is a French scientist was denied entry to the U.S. because messages that were considered critical of the president were found on their phone. And this is also happening against the backdrop of Kristi Noem doing a photo shoot in front of detainees who were arrested in the USA and deported to a prison in El Salvador without any due process.
Yeah.
It also stands to mention that Israel's starting up their war crimes again. And the USA is bombing Yemen and making plans in group chats.
Yeah. Oh, jeez.
And so in these moments where it's clear that these actions by these governments need to be challenged, the U.S. government is trying to stamp it out.
Yes.
And so that's what this is about. I thought about what I wanted to say, and new things have happened since I had thought about this. And so we'll see where we're going today. We'll see. But where do you want to start?
Yeah, no, a lot has happened, but this was a really great piece and analysis of what's been happening, particularly around Mahmoud Khalil's situation and his detainment and all of the issues surrounding it. But it to me was this visceral reminder of how awful and shameful and infuriating his entire situation is. But you're absolutely right. So much has happened since then. We've seen other incidents take place that just confirm what this administration is set out to do, what it's all about, and all of it is shameful.
Rubio saying that he's revoked 300, I think, student visas.
Yes.
So there's that too that's happened. And
and we know that the administration has sent out requests to various institutions of higher learning about their enrollment. And so, a lot is going on here. And so it's important. I'm really glad, I'm really glad that you brought this piece so that we could shine a little bit of a light on it. And it was great. One of the things that Neha said in this piece that actually gave me some pause was, quote, his detainment, speaking of Mahmoud Khalil, his detainment and further actions against students that followed highlight how attacks on anti-genocide student protesters are ramping up on several different fronts, including through the weaponization of immigration structures, the influence of Zionist outside agitators, and the full weight of the U.S. government. And I don't know, I feel like it was the escalation of that got to me, specifically that the full weight of the U.S. government piece. That's what we're dealing with here, right? We're living in a world where speaking out against the president, speaking out against the state, speaking out against its actions has become this bugaboo. And the government feels justified in responding in truly horrendous and dangerous ways that I think impact all of us. Like certainly these folks and their families are most centrally impacted, but it has an impact. I mean, you can draw the connection to the impact on all of us and all of our freedoms. And that is the part to me that's so scary about what's taking place here.
Yeah, and I saw something online yesterday about how if one person doesn't have due process, nobody has due process.
Yes.
Particularly as we talk about immigration. If ICE or the Secretary of State or whoever can just say, oh, you no longer are eligible for your visa, so we're going to detain you and deport you.
Right.
Not having an ability to appeal that means that eventually they could just come for anybody and just say, oh, well, you're not a citizen because you can't prove it, but we're not going to let you prove it. And that kind of paradox creates a situation where none of us have the opportunity to ever prove anything about the charges that we face.
And there goes our freedom.
Yes. And just held indefinitely wherever they want to put us. So, yeah, this is a story I think about that. It's also a story about students and state repression against free speech and politics that the state deems unacceptable. And so there's an undercurrent here also of institutions deciding that they will acquiesce to the demands of the Trump administration.
Right.
And so one of the things that has happened recently is that the Trump administration has threatened to keep $400 million in federal funding from Columbia.
Right.
And in exchange for that $400 million in federal funding, the Trump administration made 9 demands of Columbia University. And they basically said, yeah, sure. And so some of the things that Columbia said that they would do to get their $400 million back is hire 36 more, quote, special officers who will have the ability to remove individuals from campus and or arrest them when appropriate. They're appointing a new senior vice provost who will basically oversee the Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies departments. They're banning the use of face masks and demanding identification for anyone at protests. There's a lot here that I think will chill speech and is designed in a way to make sure that students, staff, faculty are kept in line with the talking points of the administration or of the institution and the agenda of the institution. And this is similar to something that's happening with the University of Pennsylvania, where threats to withhold funding is tied to demands of making changes on how they manage their campus. So I think this is going to be a specific tactic of the Trump administration to get more institutions in line with their politics and what they want to see institutions to be.
Well, and the 3 things that you mentioned there are so scary. I mean, hiring special officers who have that kind of power to just remove folks and arrest them.
Yeah, again, based on what? Based on whose discretion? Based on due process? Is that involved anywhere? Not mentioned. Probably not.
Yeah. Another layer of bureaucracy in an academic affairs division that already has so much, but to oversee those particular departments. Again, why those departments? Is it a Department of Ed situation where you're bringing in that senior vice provost and they're just going to eliminate those departments? I mean, what's happening here? And then the face mask thing. I mean, those are just really scary things, and that's only 3 of the 9. So.
The 9, the other ones kind of got into more like higher ed policy.
Yes.
A lot more esoteric and hard to. I could spend a lot of time probably getting into those things.
We could nerd out a little bit.
This is not the point of our conversation.
Those are indicative.
Right. Yes. Indicative of the rest of them.
Absolutely. And truly scary. And so, that's a great segue for me because Neha really highlighted some of the related happenings at Columbia, but at also some of the other institutions of higher learning as well. So Neha said, quote, last week, Columbia also expelled, suspended, and revoked the degrees of 22 students involved in the 2024 Heinz Hall demonstrations on campus. This came after the Trump administration sent the university a letter of 9 demands it must follow in order to discuss the cancellation of $400 million in federal funding. The Trump administration also sent 60 other universities letters to, quote, protect Jewish students on campus. Other universities, regardless of whether they were sent the letter, have also begun following suit, such as UCLA, which canceled a public health course on Palestinian health and launched a campus initiative to, quote, combat anti-Semitism. Yale University also abruptly suspended international law scholar Helia Dotali after a news site partly powered by AI called her a member of a terrorist group, referencing a Palestinian prison solidarity group placed on the U.S. sanctions list in 2024. So all of that is so scary, right? And one of the things I've been talking a lot lately to both colleagues, you and I have talked about this like off the mic, is just this idea of how institutions are responding and are going to respond to this new administration. And one of the things that I think should be guiding those decisions on how to respond are an institution's values and principles. And any workplace talks about and has values and principles that they tout, that they share, and new employee orientation. And colleges and universities are no different. And so I've been thinking a lot about what it means to stand on the right side of history. And I truly hope that more institutions than not decide to do just that and don't just capitulate to this fascist regime that we have running the country right now.
Yeah, I hope we see some kind of fight or response get put up sometime soon.
Absolutely.
We haven't necessarily seen it yet from institutions. Yeah. There's been some fight back from states' attorneys general.
Yes.
And
good point. Yep.
That has led to some pushback on some of the things that Trump has wanted to do with state institutions. But we'll see what that looks like.
Yeah.
Moving forward too. So one of the other pieces of this puzzle is how vigilante groups have added fuel to the fire of government repression.
Oh, that's right.
So there's this group called Beitar Worldwide that has said they've sent deportation lists of so-called terrorist sympathizers to ICE, and they're targeting naturalized citizens, which is wild.
Yes.
On a few fronts, that's wild.
Yeah.
Chip Gibbons is the policy director for Defending Rights and Dissent, and that's an organization based in D.C. And Chip said this in the article, quote, "The role of third-party vigilantes cannot be understated here, and there is a history in this country of private McCarthyites helping to facilitate, normalize, or instruct state repression. When it comes to Palestinian Americans or Palestinians, we know these private networks have been particularly vociferous and have been particularly impactful in getting what they want." And, these groups are targeting protesters and then using ICE and other law enforcement agencies to get people labeled as terrorists.
Yeah.
Which is also why a lot of abolitionists have been arguing against labeling people terrorists, because this can always be weaponized and turned around on groups and on people who are demanding freedom.
Yes, absolutely. There is a connection there, and just a simple sort of, domino effect of what can happen here. If we allow this to happen here in this sphere, like what can happen elsewhere. Yeah, and I love this sort of history lesson.
Imperial boomerang, I think, is the concept.
I like that. Absolutely. I don't like it, but I like the term. Yeah, absolutely. That's very, very scary on a lot of fronts. One of the other things that Neha points out in this piece that has just been wild to witness is the fact that it's been both simultaneously amazing to see that there have been several protests that have taken place across the country calling for justice and in response to the detainment of Mahmoud Khalil. But it's also been infuriating to see that Israel has resumed airstrikes in Gaza and killed hundreds of Palestinians. And you said that when you introed this piece. And Neha shares what this has meant for protesters in this piece. So she says, quote, "Most students and protesters around the country have been labeled as pro-Hamas supporters or anti-Semitic for their advocacy against Israel's ongoing genocide of Palestinians." Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem posted a video on X of Ranjani Srinivasan pulling a suitcase at LaGuardia Airport in New York and calling her a, quote, terrorist sympathizer. But students and student journalists on the ground say those accusations are baseless. And the reality is they are baseless. The vast majority of these protests that have taken place, especially the ones on college campuses, have been nonviolent. And they have only become violent, or violence has only been introduced when the police show up. And so the point here that Neha is making is that we've got to recognize what's actually going on here, what's actually happening here,
Yeah, the police are provoking, and there are third-party vigilante groups who are, the other side of people sending lists of names to ICE. Those people's cousins, I guess, so to metaphorically speaking.
Right.
Showing up to also create friction, create fights, and create dissent and tension in those spaces, and then bring in the cops to be like, oh,
look what's happening here. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's another element that we saw take place throughout those encampments and those protests.
Yes.
All right, but let's talk about application.
Okay.
This time, how can we apply today's article to our day-to-day lives and work? My application is about how tenuous our rights are.
Yeah.
They're delineated in a document, but they are as we have seen, easily revocable by law enforcement. We lose our rights, we lose our freedoms when things like this happen. We can't claim to be home of the free and have people get snatched off the street.
Absolutely.
By plainclothes, allegedly ICE agents, and stuffed into an unmarked van. This is about student repression. It's about speech repression. It's authoritarian governance to keep us all in line with the same thinking as the Trump administration. They want polite, civil little sheep who know when they're supposed to say bah.
Yes.
And as Jamel Bowie said at one point on Blue Sky, if they can disappear permanent residents, they can disappear citizens. This will come home to all of us at some point.
Yes.
And this is why we have to talk about it and we have to stand up against it all along the way, every step of the way. None of this can be given any room to breathe.
100%. That's 100% the application of this piece. I completely agree. The application I sort of thought about for this piece comes from something that one of Mahmoud Khalil's friends is quoted saying in this piece, and it's absolutely related to what you just talked about. His friend's name is Lauren Bone, and she said, quote, "This is not just a story about Mahmoud and his disappearance. It's also a story about all of us. In this current world order and with this current administration, we are all essentially chess pieces whose freedoms are deeply threatened, and we're watching them be slowly revoked. This is very much a trial run for the administration to see how much they can get away with." And there's a lot there. It's really scary to know that this is the world we're living in right now. And so, for me, that's the application of this situation.
Yeah.
And, the other application is the fact that we have to fight against this with everything we've got. We can't just be those sheep that you talked about. We've got to fight. And, using Lauren's words, right, this administration has gotten away with more than it should, to be honest. And, we need to do what we can to put an end to it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's talk about homework.
Okay.
It's homework time. What are we going to do to continue our learning and unlearning beyond our conversation today? I want to learn a little bit more about defending rights and dissent.
Oh, yeah.
That was mentioned in this article, and see what kind of work they're up to, particularly as we see the Trump administration really going all in on speech repression and repression of politics they deem unacceptable. Yeah, that's my homework.
I like that.
What about you?
Especially since they're local, so that would be great. So my homework is to check out some of the related articles to this one on Prism's website. When you scroll down, it's like, you read this, so check this out. So the first one was called Barnard College Expels 3 Students Who Protested for Palestine in Unprecedented Move. And the other one is called 3 Students Sue Columbia Over Suspension Tied to Pro-Palestinian Organizing. And both of these pieces actually were written by Nayanika Guha, who is a journalist focused on social justice and health and political coverage and issues. So both of those pieces sound great and like another way to explore what's been going on here. And so I want to check those out. I would also encourage folks to read Mahmoud Khalil's letter that he dictated from an ICE detention facility. It was originally published, I believe, in The Guardian, but it's out there in a lot of places now. And I just read it a little bit before we recorded today, and it's really powerful. And so I'd love to just put that out as homework for folks. If you haven't read it yet, you should absolutely check it out.
Yes, I say that. And also there's a letter from Columbia student Ranjani Srivansan, who you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
And they talk about what they were going through and why they chose to leave the United States and go to Canada.
Right.
And it is, I think it's frightening to read it and to read what they were going through in that moment. So that is also easily findable on social media. It's been shared by a lot of organizations.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that's it for our conversation today on all kinds of state
things.
Repression.
Yes.
Loss of due process, loss of free speech, lots of attacks on our rights as citizens, on our rights as free people in the United States. Because remember, the Constitution doesn't talk about citizens, it talks about persons.
Yes.
And therefore, our rights apply to anyone who is on U.S. soil.
Absolutely.
It's not, not just about citizens. And so Yeah, this is an affront to everybody who's here, regardless of their legal status.
Absolutely.
And any attack on somebody, regardless of their legal status, ends up being an attack on all of us and all of our rights.
For sure.
So that's it for today. There's enough grandstanding, I guess, here at the end. Damien, you're up next time.
Yes.
What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm going to bring an article from In These Times to the table for us to talk about next week. The piece is called For Labor, Caution is Fatal. And it was written by Stephen Lerner and published last month. And I'll be honest, I haven't read it yet, but my quick glance of it seems to be about unions and the labor movement and, what the labor movement can do in this moment of state repression that we find ourselves in, how connected these things are. But this is obviously coming at it from the labor and union lens. And so I'm looking forward to reading it and talking about it with you next time.
I have read ahead.
Oh, look at you.
And it's really good.
Yes.
So we'll have a great discussion about it next week. There's a lot in there, both about the history of labor and what labor has done and what they've stood against and what they've carved out in terms of rights for all of us, really, and how we can learn from labor, but we can also learn from SNCC, and we can learn from civil rights movement leaders, and we can learn from a lot of different places on what we can do in these moments and what that history teaches us in terms of what courage we have to show up with today in terms of those tactics and strategies and whatnot.
Yeah.
So,
good. Sounds like I picked well.
You did. Great job.
Very good.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube. Sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.